Once the American South was settled by British people, the plantation system began to take shape there. National Geographic says that Virginia was split up into parts for large-scale farming, which needed people to work the land. The South's economy was based on crops, so farms were bound to happen. Slavery happened in the American settlements because people needed to work. However, the Low Country Digital History Initiative says that the Portuguese had been capturing Africans since the 1400s. Slavery and living on a farm were common from the beginning of the United States until the Civil War. But being a slave on a farm was awful. First, Africans were taken from their homes and put on long trips that hurt or killed them badly. Finally, they were bought at sale as property. It was more like surviving on a farm than living, even in the house that looked out over the fields. Some white people cared about their slaves, but the differences in class and position between owners and slaves made that care less strong. They kept remembering that they were things. The Mississippi Historical Society says that cotton remained an important crop in the South after the Civil War of 1861. Freed African Americans could rent plots of land through the sharecropping system, but the owners often had a lot of control over their lives. Here are some bad parts of life on American farms. Slaves endured harsh punishments on plantations. Slaves on plantations were punished for many things, like being late, not working fast enough, and running away. It got worse. They were whipped, abused, cut up, and more. According to PBS, violence, either real or promised, was used to keep them as property. It's not a surprise that slaves wanted to get away from their cruel owners. Thanks to networks like the Underground Railroad, the Kansas City Public Library estimates that about 100,000 slaves were able to escape to the north. Those who weren't so lucky could be whipped, chained, and sold as punishments if they were found running away. A slave was punished by having a bell rack put around their neck. The bell would ring to let the slave owner or overseer know if the slave tried to run. In his book, Narrative of Henry Watson, former slave Henry Watson wrote about his time working on a farm and the different punishments he received or saw happen. I was severely whipped with a cow skin, the scars of which punishment I have to this day. And then I was sent to the field to work, each individual having a stated number of pounds of cotton to pick, the deficit of which was made up by as many lashes being applied to the poor slave's back as he was so unlucky as to fall short in the number of pounds of cotton which he was to have picked, he said. Watson went on to say that salt was often poured over open cuts until the blood stopped flowing, so that whipping could start again. Plantation life founded slave rebellions. The most desperate way for slaves on farms to fight back was to join together and rebel. In the United States, more than 200 rebellions were found, and many of them were put down before they could happen. Colin Palmer, a historian, said this about slavery. Unconditional submission was, understandably, not easily achieved. In fact, it was an ideal that most slave owners never attained because their often defiant chattel refused to grant it. National Humanities Center. Rebellions were planned by slaves who were desperate to get away from their masters and their lives of servitude. History says that in 1831, Nat Turner and about 80 other slaves killed 55 white people on 12 Virginia farms. Turner talked about the slaves he planned the uprising with during his confession. He said, "I saluted them on coming up and asked Will Bowcame be there. He answered, his life was worth no more than others, and his liberty as dear to him. I asked him if he thought to obtain it. He said he would, or lose his life. This was enough to put him in full confidence, based on what he said in The Confessions of Nat Turner. A lot of the time, slaves who rebelled did die. Even though rebellions caused a lot of damage, white farm owners had harsh punishments. After Turner's uprising, laws were made that made it even harder for slaves to move around, go to school, and get together in groups. Militias and mobs beat up over 200 slaves who had no idea about Turner's revolt. Plantation. Slaves and those who helped them were branded. Plantation owners could easily tell who their slaves were by branding them on the face, arm, abdomen, back, or even the back. It was also popular in the South to brand people as a way to punish them. The mark was meant to leave a lasting scar on the slave's body. This was another reminder that slaves were property, just like animals or goods for sale, says Encyclopedia. Former slave Frederick Douglass described the branding process during an 1846 lecture he delivered in England. A person tied to a post and his back, or such other parts, was branded, laid bare. The iron was then delivered red hot and applied to the quivering flesh, imprinting upon it the name of the monster who claimed the slave, via black then. White men who tried to help slaves escape bad conditions on plantations were also forever marked. In 1844, the letters SS were put on Jonathan Walker's body. A group of slaves from Florida who were part of his church tried to escape to freedom in the Bahamas. He was caught and spent a year in jail before being branded. There were letters that stood for the words slave stealer. Slave families were sold away from one another. PBS says that the constant fear of being sold was one of the worst things about being a slave on a plantation. It was easy for slave owners to sell their slaves away from their family and friends, whether they needed money or wanted to punish them. Mothers and young children were split up, as well as grandparents, cousins, and brothers who would never see each other again. The Atlantic says that in March 1859, one of the biggest sales of slaves in U.S. history took place in Savannah, Georgia. Pierce Mies Butler, the owner of a plantation, sold more than 430 slaves to pay off his debts. His grandfather was a signer of the Constitution and wrote the section about fugitive slaves. On the faces of all was an expression of heavy grief, wrote Mortimer Thompson, a reporter for the New York Tribune who went to the auction undercover. Blighted homes, crushed hopes, and broken hearts was the sad story to be read in all the anxious faces. Slaves weren't safe on plantations due to the slave codes. Even when they were working hard on their farms, slaves were never safe. Slaves in the South had to follow a loose set of rules called slave codes. This was one reason why they weren't safe. To make sure the rules were followed, groups of white men were put together to raid slave quarters and question slaves who were not on their farms. Whenever there was a real or supposed uprising, groups of white men would get together to hunt down and scare the black workers. Slaves were property, so they couldn't do many things like appear in court, make deals, own guns, or buy and sell goods. PBS says that these rules were tightened whenever there was even the slightest doubt that slaves might rise up. The Virginia General Assembly struck a blow to slaves in 1705 when it wrote its state's slave codes, writing, via PBS, all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resist his master correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened. Both masters and slaves had conflicting feelings about slave drivers. For some big farms, the field workers needed both a white supervisor and a black slave driver to keep them on task. Overseers were hated, but black slave drivers got mixed responses from both the slaves they worked for and the masters who hired them. Drivers were slaves who were in a position of power. They were both helpless and strong, as they had control over the system that bound them. They worked as slave drivers for William Pettigrew, a farm owner in North Carolina, in the 1850s. Pettigrew had to believe in his slaves because they pretty much ran his 2 farms for him. It's clear from his letters that he had doubts. In 1856, Pettigrew wrote to Moses through the National Humanities Center, "The people promised me to be industrious and obedient to you. You must remind them of this promise should any of them be disposed to forget it. I am anxious for your credit as well as my own that all things should go on well, and it would be distressing and mortifying to me to hear the contrary on my return home." In return, Moses and Henry were very polite because they knew that the guy receiving their letters held the power to kill them. He answered, "I return my respects to you. I was glad to hear from Master. I have done all day in my power towards your benefit. I was glad to hear that Master is in good health." Southern weather created health problems. PBS says that the hot and humid weather in the South caused a lot of health problems. Slaves had to stand in water for hours at a time in the hot sun while working on rice fields in the summer, which was worse than picking cotton. There was a lot of malaria and baby deaths. Field slaves had to work in the hot sun for hours on end, so they couldn't stay inside and hope it would get better. A South Carolina doctor and planter named Philip Tidyman argued in 1826 that slaves were protected by the very nature of his constitution from the unhealthiness of hot climates, which are so inimical to the whites, especially among those who may be necessitated to labor in low, swampy situations. This is what an article in the American Journal of Public Health says about Tidyman's argument. The same article quotes Charles Pinckney from South Carolina as saying, "Wherever the principal sources of national wealth, cotton, rice, and sugar, flourish, it is physically impossible for a white man to cultivate them. Those who merely superintend the labors of the blacks are poorly compensated for the risk of health and life." MIT says that the South's temperature and geography make it a good place for malaria and other parasitic diseases to grow. This led to bad things like low birth weights, high neonatal and infant mortality, stunted slave children, and the effects of protein deficiency. Women were abused and exploited. White guys who were near slave women took advantage of them. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, a story written by Harriet Jacobs in 1861, says that when she was about 14 years old, her master, his boys, the overseer, or maybe all of them started giving her gifts in order to get with her sexually. It was hoped that beating and starving her would make her give in, as J.M. Allen writes in Sexual Relations Between Elite White Women and Enslaved Men in the Antebellum South, a socio-historical analysis. And Jacob's account is only one example. As with Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, women had no way to get away from being raped, sexually abused, or forced to be a long-term partner to a white slave owner. There were no safety nets or direct escape routes, and white men took every chance they could. Slave men and white women also had sexual relationships, though they happened less often. It's possible that white women were trying to gain power in any way they could, since their husbands and fathers were in charge of their lives. On slaveholders' sexual abuse of slaves, a piece from the National Humanities Center says that sexual abuse could include forcing a relationship between two slaves who were seen as good breeders. Then, in order to make a lot of money, their kids would be sold away from their parents. Working on a plantation was backbreaking labor. Some slaves in the Caribbean had a hard time because growing and grinding sugarcane was very hard work that killed a lot of them. Every year, new slaves were brought in to replace the ones who had died. There was a time when slaves looked like they were almost at the end of their lives. If they had worked since they were teens, they would have been 40 years old. People in Britain and the United States liked sugarcane, and the workers had to do every part of the process by hand. Slaves grew the crop, took the sugar juice out of the cane, and processed it to make syrup. This was done in parts of Louisiana and Mississippi, as well as the Caribbean. The waste was turned into rum. It was very hard work planting the sugar cane because every day they had to dig hundreds of holes in the ground. Slaves worked 24 hours a day, 6 days a week during harvest time on big farms. South slaves worked on cotton farms a lot of the time. PBS says that some farms grew more than one crop, like corn, rice, tobacco, and sugarcane. Plantations and farms needed a lot of hard work that wasn't always planting and harvesting. For example, they needed people to dig ditches and clear new land. The class system between plantation slaves caused division. Plantation slaves were divided into castes based on their work. Some worked in the fields, while others worked in the house. Working in the fields was very hard, but unlike being a house slave, you didn't have to deal with white owners. Working in the fields was hard, but Lewis Clark, a house slave, knew that working in the house wasn't better either. He wrote, via Spartacus Educational, "There were 4 house slaves in this family, including myself, and though we had not, in all respects, so hard work as the field hands, Yet in many things, our condition was much worse. We were constantly exposed to the whims and passions of every member of the family. From the least to the greatest, their anger was wreaked upon us. 13 talks about things like clothes and attitude that often set household workers apart from field workers. However, field slaves were rarely given enough clothes, only in the winter. House slaves, on the other hand, were better dressed. When it comes to clothing, house slaves might wear old clothes that their white owners no longer need. Field workers liked being with each other, but house slaves who worked alone might have been swayed by what their masters said about them. Reconstruction era. Sharecropping wasn't the boon everyone hoped for. After the Civil War, African Americans were free, but the new system of sharecropping left many of them poor and even in debt to the white landowners who let them rent land. Like slaves, they were unable to leave the land for better chances because they were in debt and the law favored landowners. African Americans needed to work so that plantation owners could fix their failing economies, and plantation owners needed workers. In this case, they could rent land from white people and live their own lives otherwise. A sharecropper's contract from 1867, found at the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, starts with the following. The said Cooper Hughes Freedman with his wife and one other woman, and the said Charles Roberts with his wife Hannah and one boy, are to work on said farm and to cultivate 40 acres in corn and 20 acres in cotton. Digital history writes that very few free black people owned land, though. African Americans were poor because of unfair landlords, high interest rates, and crops that were hard to predict. This was made worse by the fact that debt was carried over from one year to the next. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.